however you're comfortable. Okay. Yeah, whatever you want to do. Okay? Yeah. Can we go ahead and get started? Good morning, actually good afternoon, and welcome. I'm Gerald Feierstein. I'm the Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's panel on an incredibly important and timely subject, which is the safe and secure return of Syrian refugees. As the war in Syria winds down, international focus on the situation there will shift to the question of reconstruction, and especially the return home of the Syrian refugee population. In reaching a decision for themselves and their families, all Syrians will grapple with a range of concerns in terms of their personal safety, their economic circumstances, and the potential for reconstruction in Syria. Those concerns are compounded and especially important for those displaced Syrians contemplating their return to their homes. To aid in understanding this unfolding dynamic, the World Bank has released a report entitled The Mobility of Displaced Syrians, an Economic and Social Analysis. The bank has delved into the unique challenges and considerations Syrians must take into account when planning a return to Syria. The report, is based on an analysis of the voluntary return of more than 100,000 Syrian refugees, seeks to understand the key factors that influence their decisions. Using various technical measurements, the bank compared this group of refugees who returned between 2015 and 2018 with millions of others in Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon who have thus far chosen not to return. The results were also compared with other refugee situations around the world, including Iraqi refugees in pre-war Syria, as well as refugee populations in the Balkans and Somali refugees in Kenya. If you have not already done so, please pick up a copy of the report, which is on the table outside. Here to discuss the report, we're honored to have two of the authors. Harun Onder, the lead author of the report, is a senior economist in the Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. His work at the bank has focused on the economics of conflict and forced displacement, international trade policy, economic implications of demographic transitions, and challenges faced by natural resource-rich economies. Currently, Harun leads the World Bank's analytical program on the Syrian conflict. He was the lead author of World Bank flagship reports, the Mobility of Displaced Syrians, the report we're discussing today, as well as The Toll of War and the Economics of Hosting Refugees. Saroj Kumar Jha is the regional director of the Mashreq department of the World Bank Group and also an author of this report. He brings to the Mashreq region a vast experience in a critical period of transition. Before this, he was the senior director for the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Global Practice at the World Bank Group since February 2016. He provided strategic leadership, addressing the challenge of fragility, conflict, and violence, working across the World Bank Group and in close collaboration with partners. He joined the World Bank in 2005 as a senior infrastructure specialist in the Sustainable Development Network after working for the Government of India and the United Nations agencies as a senior executive in the field of public sector management. And infrastructure financing, natural resource management, natural disaster prevention, and environmental sustainability. We're also lucky to have Mona Yacoubian with us today to lend her perspective to the challenges of returning refugees and the circumstances they face in Syria. Mona joined the U.S. Institute of Peace after serving as Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Middle East Bureau at USAID from 2014 to 2017, where she had responsibility for Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. She currently serves as Executive Director for the congressionally mandated Bipartisan Syria Study Group. Prior to joining USAID, Mona was a senior advisor at the Stimson Center, where her work focused on the Arab uprisings with an emphasis on Syria. She also served as a special advisor on the Middle East at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where her work focused on Lebanon and Syria, as well as on broader issues related to democratization in the Arab world. I look forward to moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, please remember to silence your cell phones, but remember to tweet using the hashtag MEISyria. Additionally, we look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's events here at MEI on the changing landscape of Saudi art at 12:30 and on Gulf economics at 2:30. And people who need a place to stay overnight can probably stay here in the ballroom. Please register online at mei.edu to join us. We're going to begin with a brief presentation by the authors before asking Mona to comment, and then we'll have an opportunity to elaborate further in our discussion, including giving all of you an opportunity to ask your questions or provide comments. Please join me to begin the conversation in welcoming Saroj Kumar Jha to the podium.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Feierstein. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Middle East Institute for hosting the World Bank team here for the launch of this very important report on the mobility of displaced Syrians. I also want to thank Mona for being part of this panel, and we're looking forward to your perspectives on this. I want to say a few words before we hand over to Harun, who is the author of this report. I'm based in Beirut, and this issue of Syrian refugees we observe this every day, is very much in my mind. As an individual, as a resident of the city, we live this every day. And I also work on Jordan, on Iraq, on KRG. And when Harun was working on the economic and social impact assessment of the conflict inside Syria, what is known as the Toll of War report, we were confronted with many additional questions at the end of that study, and one of which was to understand how displaced people make choices, whether to return or to stay, beyond what we know from conventions and agreements and political declarations. Purely from an economic and social perspective, how do human beings make those choices? When people are displaced from conflict, they have no option. But once they have displaced, they have options. And this study essentially came out of our discussion about a year ago, that can we really understand this a bit more? We knew then this was a very complex issue, and no single analysis or report will be adequate to really understand the human mind and how we pick signals to various social and economic changes, policies and incentives. So we thought it would be very important to understand, especially given that the World Bank Group itself does not have any operational engagement inside Syria. But what we could do is to provide our economic expertise and bring in some of these analytical work to inform those governments, multilateral, bilateral organizations, and think tanks who are engaged in various processes involving the political resolution of the Syrian crisis, but also those who are engaged in a discussion on safe, voluntary, and dignified return of the Syrians when the time is appropriate. So we thought this could be a very small, a very humble contribution of our institution. But we were very aware that we are going to engage in a research topic which is very complex. And but we will use this essentially to advance the discussion, to engage in a dialogue with all of you. And this study, I think Harun will talk about it, but I do want to share with you that has been a very collaborative process. Right from the word start, we've engaged the governments in the region, the civil society, private sector, diplomatic community, every single stakeholder in Lebanon, in Jordan, but also the capitals in US, in Europe, and of our important stakeholders who are engaged in the process, and of course the much broader UN family. And we've kept them engaged through the entire process from the time we started working on this study, and this continues. And today's discussion here is very much part of the objective of the World Bank Group to bring credible, rigorous research on very complex topics, particularly in the space of conflict and violence and displacement, so that any decision made by governments, multilateral, bilateral organizations, are more based on evidence, less by perceptions. So bring more objectivity. And one of the lessons in my short term that I had in the bank here, working on fragility, conflict, and violence, is that this is politically a very sensitive topic to work on issues of fragility, conflict, and violence. And the best contribution of the development community is to bring evidence into that space so that we are able to essentially work a lot more on peace-related issues by bringing the narrative of development. And as Deputy Secretary General, former Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson once said, peace for development and development for peace, they go together. So I think this essentially, you will see the study today, it brings in the development perspective into a very sensitive topic. But thank you very much again for being here, and I look forward to the panel discussion. And with your permission, I'm going to straight away hand over to Harun for the presentation of the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Saroj. It's great to be here, and thank you for coming for this discussion. This is a report that we produced in close collaboration with UNHCR, and we received support from German government and the Canadian government, as well as a state and peace building fund, which comprises many countries. So just a brief background, in addition to what Saroj said, in the bank we didn't conduct any analysis or operations in Syria until 2017. Operations we still don't conduct, but in 2017 we published our first analysis on Syria. And this was the Toll of War report. We looked at the economic and social impact of the conflict within Syria. You might have heard the number of $226 billion. So we tried to estimate the economic losses due to the conflict. And we also tried to decompose what explains this economic impact, through which channels it manifested itself. For example, when you open the newspaper, still today the Syrian conflict is associated with physical destruction and casualties. But this was the report. For the first time, we estimated what we call the invisible factors, which is economic disorganization, like the breakdown of business networks, social networks, degradation in institutions, and degradation in social trust. So what can we say about these invisible factors? We found out that those factors are 20 times more important to explain the economic losses in Syria than physical destruction. If the collapse of infrastructure and destruction of buildings can explain $1 loss, the invisible factors, the economic disorganization, explains $20. And after this study, as Saroj mentioned, based on our consultations, we realized that we also need to understand what happened in the region to Lebanese economy, the Jordanian economy, and Iraqi economy. So how were those economies affected by the conflict in Syria? That we took ourselves as our homework. And based on our consultations with the governments, we quickly realized that, yes, it is important to understand what has happened in Lebanon, Jordan, since 2011 up to this point. But the policymakers in the region are ahead of us in terms of thinking. They're already concerned about what might happen next, depending on developments in Syria. We like it or not, there is some sort of an imperfect stabilization within the country. For example, the Economist Intelligence Unit, in January, they announced the GDP growth forecasts for all countries, and they projected the Syrian GDP to grow by 9.9% in 2019. We don't do our estimations, so we cannot speculate on whether this number is too high or too low, but it's important, and to put that into perspective, that is the highest growth rate in the world in 2019. Yes, it starts from a lower level, like a very small base, so any activity has a lot of influence, but it shows that the downward collapse trend is slowly changing. So what can the Lebanese authorities or the Jordanian authorities or the Iraqi authorities expect as a result of this slow and imperfect recovery? Can the trade bounce back? Can they recoup some of their economic losses due to the Syrian conflict? While we were thinking about how we would go about answering these questions, we quickly realized that much depends on whether the refugees will go back or not. So how the economic recovery in Syria can affect the Lebanese economy depends whether refugees will go back or they'll stay there or not. And based on this, we quickly realized that we have to have a theory of what do refugees do when there is economic recovery in their hometown. So and we call this a mobility calculus. So all the factors that a refugee can take into consideration when making a decision about whether he or she wants to move back or not. And that's the topic of this report. We try to understand what is this mobility calculus. Yes, it's an extremely complex problem. Everything matters, but can we say a bit more about it? Can we say a bit more about then everything is about security or everything matters? So if security matters, how much does it matter? Is it 1% or is it 50%? If everything matters, let's say whether there is water, there is electricity, there is schools or hospitals, how much do these things matter for the refugees when they make the decision to go back or not? And this is the kind of heroic effort that we undertook in this report. So given the complexity and ambition of the task, we developed an analytical methodology which has 5 steps. The first one is we looked at the international experience, the refugee situations, similar situations elsewhere. What were the factors that helped refugees go back their home, and what were the factors that prevented them to go back home? So we took a list of these factors. This is the leftmost one on the screen that you see there. And on the top one, we tried to measure these factors in the case of Syrian refugee situation. If it is about security, what sort of security issues do we face today in this governorate or another governorate in Syria, and what kind of security issues are there in the refugee host nations? Then we try to use this more than 100,000 verified returns between 2015 and 2018 to try to see how important are these different factors in the case of Syrian refugees' return. And this data comes from UNHCR's registration system, and these returns are verified. The actual returns might be higher, but we know that these are verified minimum returns, and we know these people's characteristics. We know whether they are tall, whether they are short, they are coming from Raqqa, or they are coming from Hasakeh, and whether they are there with their families or they are there by themselves. So we can compare these people with other refugees who didn't return and try to see which characteristics are different. So what can we say about whether one factor explains return or not? Next, the two next steps, the final ones, the scenarios and mobility simulations. As we were thinking about the returns that have taken place so far, we quickly realized that the returns that we are talking about, the future, the large-scale return that may or may not happen at some point, but the concept of large-scale return is different than what has happened so far. The returns so far have been small, very selective, and if it happens, the large-scale return will be quite different. So how can we conjecture about this large-scale return? For that, we used a scenario-based approach, and we developed a simulation model that we also used in the Toll of War report to estimate the economic losses. I'm going to talk more about those in the presentation. And as Saroj said, I'm the author of the report. Oh, by the way, we have 70 more people, sorry. It's a big team. So it was a big team. We had from World Bank experts and from UNHCR. Pretty much covers all sectors that the World Bank operates in. And I'm going to read them one by one now, so bear with me. So okay, I'll save you from that. Okay, so I'll give you so the report is, as you might have seen, it's thick, it's dense, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information. It's almost impossible to go over most of that in a half an hour talk. So what I'll present you now, the summary results, the broad messages that we have from this analysis, and after this I'll go into a bit more how we found these results. So the first one is about the economic and social context faced by Syrians inside Syria and in host communities. The main message that we have here is that when you look at the popular discourse, sometimes the refugees are framed as these people benefit from better security in the host countries, but at the same time, better economic opportunities. But in certain ways, there's an underlying assumption that's not always explicitly stated, and it is this. These people would come to Lebanon or Jordan even if there was no conflict, but the borders were open. So these are, to a certain extent, economic migrants, and they would come if we let them before because of the better economic opportunities. So this is the underlying assumption that we often face. What we found in this report, this is not true. And for most refugees, there is a clear trade-off between living in a safe environment and living in economically better terms. So they have access to safe environment at the expense of quality of life. And how do we see this? When you look at the extreme poverty rates, the Syrians in Syria and Syrians in Lebanon, Jordan face surprisingly close poverty rates. It's between 55 to 67% in Syria, between 51 to 61% Jordan, and between 37 to 50% in Lebanon. So the extreme poverty rates are surprisingly close. The more clear, the more surprising result is the school enrollment. The Syrian children in Lebanon and Jordan have lower school attendance rate than Syrian children in Syria. So when you look at the school enrollment ratios, 42% Lebanon, 56% Jordan, 61% in Syria. Yes, there's a quality issue. The education quality in Syria might be different than education quality in Lebanon and Jordan, but this tells us that it's not all rosy in Lebanon and Jordan or in other host countries. There's a short-term trade-off. In the short term, we run away, save our lives, but in the long term, our kids stay out of school. Girls stay out of school to get married at an early age. Boys drop out to make the extra dollar for the survival of the family. And the trade-off is that these people, these kids, at that age, their human capital accumulation stops. For the rest of their life, they are going to work at pretty much the similar wages. And these children and the children of these children will be trapped in that low-quality life for generations going forward. So there's a clear trade-off between having access to security and economic quality of life. The second result that I'm going to talk about is, again, another popular misconception about the host countries, and I will be brutal about the formulation of that. If we make refugees' lives miserable, they will go back. This is the popular misconception. It's not true. In this report, we find evidence against this. And what we found is that, yes, the conditions in Syria, like security and better access to services like school, education, electricity, if they improve, there are more returns by looking at the returns that have taken place so far. But the conditions in the host countries have very complex effects. It's not trivial like that. If they face difficult conditions, they don't necessarily go back. In fact, we found cases where it's the opposite. For example, when you compare the refugees who have access to an extra meal per day, they are 15% more likely to return. Let me repeat. Having extra meal a day, 15% more likely to return, not less. So similarly, when you look at the education profile, refugees with primary education are more likely to return than refugees with no education. But when you look at the secondary and tertiary levels, then those are less likely. So it's a complex effect. It's not very monotonic. And the last result, this is about the future returns. Again, we have our scenarios, and we estimate how much return would take place under each conditions. But what we found is that, first of all, security matters in Syria. If security doesn't improve, it prevents returns through multiple channels. First of all, it's a direct channel. People don't want to go back to a place where there is a significant chance of either being arrested or forcibly taken into army. But at the same time, security reduces the effectiveness of reconstruction or service restoration. So if there is insecurity, you can inject money into the economy, but most of it will be wasted. If security improves, your intervention is more effective. So this has consequences. Because the injection of money is less effective, any partner would be less inclined to inject money into this economy if the security conditions defined broadly, including all human and property rights, do not improve. So these are the three main blocks of messages and results we have. And now I'm going to walk you through how we arrived at this point. I will try to be less technical, but you should be warned that, unfortunately, this is a technical report. It's not a political report. We are looking at purely technical aspects, and we pay a lot of attention to our methodology. We want it to be transparent, and we want it to be clear how we do our calculations. So when we look at the international experience, this is a very, very short one. We identified 4 categories of factors that influence returns one way or another. The first one is security. The second one is livelihood options. The third one is access to assets, like the housing and land and property rights issues. And then the last one is access to services like education, health, water, electricity. And these factors matter both as pull factors, meaning conditions in Syria, and push factors, meaning conditions in host countries. These are the lessons that we derive from reviewing many refugee situations elsewhere. But overall, what we see is that refugee returns are very complex processes. It's not like one day refugees wake up and they decide to go back home. It's a circular process. Sometimes one family member goes back, assesses the conditions, and then calls the others if everything is fine, and becomes refugee again if everything is not fine. And sometimes the returnees become displaced again internally because they cannot get out. In this case, we use the UNHCR's tracking system, which stops at the border, which means that once the refugees go in Syria, we don't know where they are. So I'll be talking about that in this case. Overall, globally, the returns are relatively small compared to the new refugee generation each year. All right, so let's look at the conditions faced by Syrian refugees. So this is data. If any of you are interested in the research part of it, one achievement of this study is that there has been a lot of efforts to try to generate data about the conditions in Syria, conditions in host countries, and also the refugees' own characteristics through surveys. But these information, bits and pieces of information, were all over the place. In this study, we tried to bring together all these three dimensions together: conditions in Syria, conditions in host countries, and refugees' own social and demographic characteristics, and then analyze it. In addition, we conducted some remote sensing-based assessment, which means that we used the satellites to assess the conditions in Syria, because we don't operate in Syria, we don't know what goes there, because we don't talk to Syrian government, we don't talk to any entity that talks to Syrian government there, or linked to the Syrian government. And this shows our remote sensing assessments. We have been doing this for a while. Previously, we first tried it for 3 cities, then expanded it to 10 cities, and then 15 cities now. The interesting thing that we did in this study is that typically when you consider remote sensing, you're talking about damage assessments. How many school buildings are destroyed in Syria in different cities? How many hospitals are destroyed or damaged? This is the left panel. You see that. This is Aleppo. It's a conventional damage assessment by using the satellite imagery. The new thing that we did in this report is that we assessed both damages, whether the school buildings are damaged or not, but we also assessed functionality, whether a specific school is operational or not, a hospital is operational or not. And you see in the Aleppo map, the green crosses are operational hospitals. Even if they are partially damaged, they are operational. The red crosses are non-functional hospitals. The shaded areas that you see on the right panel is the traffic activity. The red is the highest and the green is the lower traffic activity. You clearly see where the life is in Aleppo city. While we were trying to analyze the conditions in Syria, we hit a roadblock in terms of how to make sense of the data that we observe. And I'm going to use an analogy to make it simpler. Imagine there was a village in Syria, and there were only 100 people before the conflict. And there were 100 water taps. Okay? So each person had a water tap, and everybody had water. Then conflict comes, and 50 water taps are destroyed, and 50 people become either IDPs or refugees. You go and you conduct a survey, 50 people, 50 water. You ask them, do you have water? Yes, everybody has water. You see the problem. There's a problem here. This shouldn't be the case, because the fact that everybody has water today doesn't mean that when the refugees come back, they will have water. They won't have water. So this shows that when you look at when you take a picture within Syria, that might be misleading, just the survey responses. So we developed this methodology. We call this evaluating the service access by looking at first destruction, whether the water taps are destroyed or not. Second, displacement, whether people moved or not. And the third, disorganization. If you remember the Aleppo picture, you might have 50 water taps on this side of the town, but people are on the other side. There's a problem with the disorganization, so that's a problem. So you have to consider all three dimensions of the service access. On the left panel, you see the population, net population changes in Syria. This is interesting because it's a 100-meter resolution. Okay, so within Syria map, each dot represents 100-meter resolution and how the population changes. The red areas show the net population outflows, and the green areas are the net population inflows. Interesting things are, you see that along the Euphrates, there's a lot of displacement, net outflow, whereas in Idlib area, there's a lot of inflows. If you don't consider all these three dimensions, destruction, displacement, and disorganization, you might have some interesting results that don't make sense. I'd like to show you this right panel here. This is the hospital beds per 1,000 people, 2010 versus 2018 in Syria. What do you see? It increased. The hospital beds per 1,000 people in Syria increased as a result of the conflict. How can we make sense of this? Well, we can make sense of this because we are ignoring the population movements. People moved from small, let's say, villages or small towns where there were no hospitals to larger urban centers where there are hospitals. And when you average them out, you kind of get this distorted statistics. But you're ignoring that displacement angle and you're ignoring the disorganization angle if you only look at this graph. Let's bring those angles back. This is nurses and midwives per 1,000 people, physicians per 1,000 people. Decreased substantially. Now it makes sense. So when you look at the disorganization side, now the service access makes sense. So we did this for all governorates, and here we developed a deprivation ranking for different governorates, looking at the living standards, livelihoods, and human capital, and we ranked the governments in terms of where the greatest deprivation is and where the least deprivation. And it's not surprising, the greatest deprivation in Idlib, and the least is in Tartus, and everybody else is in between. There's a lot of information on this in the report, so I'm not going to go into detail. So let's look at who returned and who didn't return. So this is UNHCR's official numbers between 2015 and mid-2018. The number of people who returned to Syria verified was 103,090. And proportionally speaking, the greatest returns were from Iraq, 10.8%, and then Jordan, 6.6%. Then we have Lebanon, 1.5%, and Turkey, 1.1%. Again, these are proportions. These are not the nominal numbers. As I said, so we have, this is very small compared to the 5.6 million refugees that are officially registered by UNHCR. A very small number. But this is 100,000 people. We can ask questions. We can see whether they are rich, whether they are poor, or they are coming from, again, Raqqa, or they are coming from Dara, and compare them with the people who didn't return. On the left-hand side, you see the refugee age and the returnee age and non-returnee age. So, sorry, these are a bit funky graphs. They are often called violin charts because on the right one, you see that kind of looks like violin. But what you need to look at is the only one half of it. It shows you the age distribution. And on the right-hand side, it shows you the education distribution. But for our purposes, let's only look at the red lines that we have in the middle. Those are the median values, the average values. So when we look at non-returnees and returnees, the returnees are on average older because the non-returnees usually have more kids. Children don't return. If a family is there with children, they are less likely to return, whereas if children are not there, they are more likely to return. On the right-hand side, you see the education profile. The returnees are on average more educated than non-returnees. So this is another popular methodology misconception that I want to fight today. When we look at the right-hand side chart only, and see that the returnees are more educated, does that mean that if we educate the refugees, then they'll go back? So this is, again, too straightforward conclusion, which is not necessarily true, and we dispute it with one slide here. Because I told you that there are not many children in returnees group, and I told you that returnees are more educated. Well, children are not supposed to be in school between the age of 0 and 6 or 7, then why are we including them? We have to separate them. We have to look at only the adult education. And let's look at that. I changed the slide on the right-hand side. When we look at only the adult education, the returnees are less educated. So this shows that when you compare who returns and who don't return, don't look at only one factor. You have to look at many things. Maybe the returnees are coming from Dara, and non-returnees are coming from Raqqa. Maybe the returnees are rich or poor. Maybe the returnees are male or female. So we have to control for a lot of factors before we can say that this factor explains the return by a certain percentage. And that's what we do in this study. We are controlling for all factors, conditions in Syria, including access to bread, access to healthcare, the security concerns, many dimensions. And we control for the conditions the refugees face in the host countries. And we control for refugees' own personal characteristics, whether they're young, old, male, female, married, not married. And this lovely figure, graph, tells you lots of numbers, but let me summarize it for you. What we find is that the older the refugees, the more likely they are to return. And if they are not members of nuclear families, like let's say it's a grandfather, it's a cousin who is there by himself, who doesn't have his own family in Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq, then that person is more likely to return. Females, less likely. The bigger the family size, the less likely they are to return. And education has a mixed impact. As I mentioned before, primary school education, more likely. Secondary, tertiary, less likely. Again, I'm continuing. These are the conditions in Syria. We see that insecurity, if there is an insecurity concern, less likely return. And then if basic services is a concern, like electricity, water, then less likely to return. And then we have the push factors in addition to the previous one. So the ones that I mentioned to you so far are what we call generalized effects, which means that those numbers or those effects are true for all refugees. But you might tell me that, hey, Harun, you're talking about these effects, but why should a family care about school access if they don't have children? So what's the problem of that family? What factors would that family face? Or if the family is, if they have a sick person in the family, they will care more about the healthcare access in Syria. So how can we kind of approach this complexity? Refugees are not a uniform type of people. These are just like us. Everybody is different. So how can we put everybody into the same pot and say that, okay, this factor is explained by 5%? No, we don't need to. And in this exercise here, which is a machine learning, it's called a decision tree, we look at which factors explain the return behavior for different types of individuals. And just let me give you an example. This is a computer algorithm. It takes all those factors, the conditions in Syria, the conditions they face in host communities, and their personal characteristics, and try to separate who returned from who didn't return by looking at as minimal number of factors as possible. One example, this room, I see 3 reddish sweaters here. So if we were to write a computer algorithm to say, okay, who wears a red jumper or red sweater in this room, so probably the computer would take some look at the data here. It would say, okay, the right side of the room, I don't see any red jumper. So is this person sitting on the left or the right? This side is gone. Next, I see we have, I don't know, maybe the pants are black. So is this person wearing a black pant or a blue pant? So trying to isolate these 3 colleagues as quickly as possible. So this is what the machine is doing here. Who returned, who didn't return, which factors get to that point as quickly as possible. And I don't know whether I could walk there. I wish I could, but let me walk anyway. So when you look at this side, so this is this person a nuclear family member? Yes. And is he coming from an area where the dread factor is greater than 34, which means that the conflict has been intensive? So nuclear family member, intensive conflict in hometown? Yes. Is the conflict really intensive? Yes. This person will not go back. Okay, very, very small number. So a nuclear family member coming from a really conflict-intensive area won't go back. Let's go the opposite extreme. Not a nuclear family member, so this is a grandfather or this is a cousin in close communities. He doesn't have the core family with him. And is he coming from a conflict-intensive area? Let's choose no. Then this person is likely to go back. A grandfather, grandmother, or a cousin who has his family back in Syria, coming from a relatively peaceful area, much more likely to go back. Let's choose something else. Let's complicate things a bit more. So he's not a nuclear family member, but coming from a conflict-intensive area. Okay, not a peaceful, but conflict-intensive area. Then the question is he old or young? So now we need to see whether it's a grandfather or it's a cousin. If he's old, okay, he's still likely to go back. A grandfather coming from a relatively conflict-intensive area still can go back. But if he's young, less than 55, then the binding factor becomes economic conditions in Syria. If the bread factor is greater than 64, which is bread is very expensive, then no. If it's not greater than 64, there are good economic opportunities, then yes. So what I'm showing you here is that for different subgroup of people, the binding conditions are different, and through this analysis we can shed some light on these decision factors. All right, this is the last group of results, the policy simulations. Again, one of the results that we had previously in the analyzing who returned and who didn't return was that, for example, if an area is not controlled by Syrian government, then refugees are more likely to return. But going forward, those areas are less and less on the map. So what can we say about future return compared to past return? We have to have a systematic method to take into consideration things that might happen in the future. And to this effect, we use as I mentioned, the model that we built for the toll of war. I'm not going to get into details, but these are fairly sophisticated computer models. We use the data that we collected to calibrate the model to make sure that it fits to the data so far. And we built scenarios. We built scenarios not necessarily like a political grand scenarios about what might happen to Syria, but we built scenarios about the conditions on the ground in Syria. For each governorate, we considered several factors like who controls that area and whether controlling group has administrative capacity or not, whether they have financial capacity or not, whether reconstruction in that area is a priority for the controlling group or not. So we have 8 of these factors. And for each governorate, we generated 3 possible paths for each of these factors. And then we combine them in a bottom-up fashion. We combine them to come up with scenarios about 2 major factors: security in Syria and service restoration in Syria. So we have 3 scenarios: a baseline, a pessimistic and optimistic scenario about security, Again, baseline, pessimistic, optimistic scenario about service restoration. And we looked at what would happen to return. I call this slide the most disappointing slide. Just let me know if you disagree, but because in this analysis, we don't announce that the analysis suggests 500 or 5,000 or 500,000 people will return. That's our baseline result. We do not disclose that result. But what we tell you is that if your optimistic scenario takes place instead of the baseline, then your returns will be 5 percentage points higher than baseline. So in addition to the baseline returns, which you don't know because we haven't told you, we have 5 percentage points of refugees, of all refugees. Okay? It's not 5% more return. It is 5 percentage points of refugees who return in addition to the original one. So that is in the optimistic case. In the pessimistic case, we have 10% less. The more interesting result is on the right-hand side. This shows that we try to separate the security conditions from service restoration. The service restoration is much more effective in convincing people to return in a good security environment. So if the security is a problem, you might restore services, but people will not come back. And we have the quantitative estimations for that. And this is the final slide, before the final slide. What this shows is that this is about the policy for the international community. What is our objective in terms of refugee returns? Are we trying to maximize the refugee returns? Or what are we trying to achieve by policies that we undertake on a daily basis? To shed some light on this question, we compared 3 alternative policy actions. One is we spend all our money to subsidize the refugee returns. Assume that international community has a bucket of money, and we are trying to see how we want to spend it. So we have 3 cases. We spend all that bucket to give it to refugees, conditional on their return. If you return, you get this money. The second unrealistic policy action is we use all that money to restore services within Syria. And the third one is we use all that money just to distribute to people within Syria. So what happens if we choose one versus the other one versus the other one? So in economic jargon, we call this a corner solution. We only choose one tool. We don't choose the other tools. This shows that, yes, if the international community is trying to maximize the returns, it can. If you give all the bucket to refugees, conditional on their return, more refugees will return. But this is not a good thing. This is not a good thing for their welfare of the refugees themselves, the welfare of the Syrians in Syria, and the welfare of the host communities who are hosting the refugees. And we have some quantitative estimates on that, but I'm not going to go too much into detail. Okay, so in conclusion, we have three key blocks of results and messages in this report. The first one is, as I mentioned, taking refuge is not a win-win situation for refugees. It's a trade-off. You get security, but you give away the quality of life. That's a return. In the return problem, you have to remember this. Like, refugees are not there for economic reasons. They're there for security concerns. And they're paying for it. It's costly for them to be there. The second one is there's an asymmetry between how conditions in Syria and conditions in host countries affect the return decision. Improvements in Syria always lead to better returns. But this doesn't strictly extrapolate to host country conditions. If you make their lives miserable, they don't necessarily go back. And to complicate the problem, not only they don't go back, but you will end up with refugees who don't have education. So this is an area where we will investigate in our next report, but we can already say that. And the last one is the how do we approach this problem in terms of policies. We have three key messages. First, from a purely economic perspective, again, this report is not about the political side of the problem. The World Bank is not an organization who investigates the political side of the problem. We look at the economic technical side. First, from an economic perspective, using a diversified policy toolkit makes sense. You don't want to put all your money for subsidizing return. That's a bad idea. This corner solution is a bad idea. But how much money you want to put on service restoration in Syria is determined by how quickly the security conditions can improve in Syria. And by security, I don't mean necessarily only absence of violence, but also the human rights, the property rights. It's a sense of whether refugees, they feel secure or not. The faster they feel secure, the more economic logic there is to try to improve the service access, because that leads to greater returns. And finally, when you try to allocate the resources, the international community's resources, don't try to maximize the return, try to maximize the welfare of refugees, their hosts, and Syrians in Syria. And this is my economistic way to conclude a presentation from Adam Smith a couple of centuries ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harun, for an excellent presentation and a lot of very interesting material there. And so let me turn first to Mona Yacoubian to ask her for her thoughts and comments and maybe some ideas for onward discussion.
Great, Jerry, thank you. Thanks to MEI for hosting this very important event. I'm very heartened by how full this room is, which suggests that this is still a topic of concern to people, and I'm glad to hear that. I want to commend the World Bank for, and Harun in particular, for your excellent work, both with this report as well as the toll of war and other work. You all have really focused diligently and with great precision on the many complex challenges that we see in Syria today and emanating from it. What I thought I would do, and I want to be brief so that the audience has a chance to engage, is first offer just a few framing comments and then some thoughts on the report itself and then just some quick conclusions. In terms of framing, I think it is really important that we understand the Syrian refugee crisis in its context, which is we should not forget this is the most significant displacement crisis since the end of World War II. It is estimated that there are 5.6 million Syrian refugees and 6.2 million internally displaced people. So I think when we think of displacement in Syria, we need to think for sure of the refugees, but also of those IDPs, those who are internally displaced. And in understanding the magnitude of this crisis, we need to bear in mind the second and third order impacts of this level of displacement. And that we really are, I think, looking at a generational challenge that will shape not only Syria, that will shape the region, and that has had reverberations well beyond the Middle East. Second comment is, I think it's really important to put in context the number of refugee returns. So I think the figure is about 100,000 between 2015, I think, and 2018. UNHCR also notes, I found a statistic, only 37,000 refugees returned in 2018. And so it's important to underscore just how minuscule the number of returns actually are with respect to the overall number of refugees. The other piece to bear in mind is how sustainable are these returns. I had access to some figures from a Turkish researcher who was looking at Syrian refugees returning into the Euphrates Shield area, which is this area in the northern part of Syria that is essentially under Turkish control. And so it's a relatively stable area. And the figure that was quoted to me was that it was estimated in 2018 254,000 Syrians returned voluntarily to this Euphrates Shield area or to Turkish-controlled areas. Of those, 194,000 returned back to Turkey in the same year. It's not just returns, it's sustainable returns. The other figure that I think we have to bear in mind, and maybe this is going to feed the next report, Harun, is that according to UNHCR, host countries host refugees for on average 17 to 25 years. So that is more than a generation. And it is a significant figure, which I think is borne out by the data we've seen so far with respect to Syria and refugee returns. And again, underscores the magnitude of the challenge, its generational sort of dimensions. And I think in particular, it's really important to underscore the impact on children. And the estimate that really roughly about half of Syrian school-age children, refugees, are not in school. That's going to have an enormous impact. We also haven't talked about the other invisible wound of the Syrian war, which is trauma and the psychosocial impacts on refugees and on children. We hosted an event at USIP last year on this topic, and the notion that there's really a danger of these children, who are the future of Syria, literally, being damaged, being permanently damaged if this significant trauma is not addressed. In terms of the report itself, and again, kudos on the enormous work that went into this, and also the collaboration that you had with UNHCR, which is great to see that kind of collaboration going on. This is such an incredibly complex challenge. And I think, Harun, you noted that in many, many ways throughout your presentation, and so I applaud that. For me, I think what's important, though, is to underscore that the report, as it notes, explicitly excludes, and this is because of the World Bank's mission, so it's no criticism at all intended, but it doesn't address the political factors, security sector issues, cultural or ethical considerations. And yet, in Syria, if we don't look at those factors, we're going to miss a big part of the picture. And it's not for the World Bank, perhaps, to do. There's other work that's been done on this. I know that the Middle East Center of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut did an interesting report on refugee returns. But I guess what I would say, and I don't want to say this too crudely, but I think if we don't look at those political factors, we are going to lose a very important part of the picture. So to take your water tap example, you know, if we don't understand that it could be that the water tap is there, perhaps it's in another part of town, but access to that tap is impeded because of either one's sect or ethnicity, or because someone was on the opposition side and this now is back into regime control, or because there are enduring communal tensions that have not been addressed that impede that access to the tap. That, too, has to flow into the calculations of understanding returns and the prospect of sustainable returns. I would underscore the report's, I think, very cogent and important conclusion that I think the report rightly notes, it says, of the greatest importance by far for Syrian refugees is security. And I think you, Harun, talked about a bit of this, but there are all kinds of issues, from fear of impending or resumed conflict, fear of regime reprisals, of forced conscription, lack of, again, sufficient levels of reconciliation, genuine reconciliation at the community level. There's also the issue of, and we can talk about this with respect to infrastructure, but IED littering. So areas of Syria that were occupied by ISIS, there is an enormous amount of IEDs that have littered the area. And this is something else, I think, to keep in mind about Syria. It is such an incredibly diverse country that we have to think about returns. And I know you've noted this, Harun, but it's really important to underscore the diversity and the complexity of Syria, and that we can't think of returns in any sense sort of monolithically. We actually have to think about local and even hyper-local dynamics that have an impact on returns. I could tick through, but I think I'll just maybe say one more thing with respect to some of the factors that you identified in the report as being drivers for return, the absence of which would then, of course, impede return. And I think, in particular, the issues around housing, land, and property, and increasing amounts of work are being done on this, but the ways in which refugees in particular have been disenfranchised, have had their property expropriated through legal means. There's the Law 10 and others. I'm not an expert on this. Many others, though, have done and continue to do very, very good work on this. And I think it does sort of speak to this idea of demographic re-engineering, of trying to basically change the map of Syria, all of which, I think, contributes to difficulties in terms of having any sort of sustained return. And that leads me to, before concluding, just the notion of then something that's near and dear to my heart when I worked at USAID, and that is the issue of refugees in host communities. So we talked a lot about win-win, not in the same context, Harun, that you laid out. Which is a very fair point, that in exchange for not being barrel bombed and being in a place that is relatively secure, but one also then unfortunately has that there are huge deficits in terms of quality of living and so forth. For us, we looked at win-wins in terms of how can we, understanding that it's more likely than not that refugees will be in host communities for an extended period of time, how do we search for those win-win solutions defined as solutions that benefit refugees and the communities that are hosting them? And this is an incredibly difficult challenge. And I think as many of you in the audience may well know, the vast majority of Syrian refugees, of course, are not in camps. They live in and amongst communities. And this poses many issues, in particular with respect to school and work. And it's such a difficult nut to crack. If anything, it's my sense, I've been out of it a little bit over the last couple of years, but I think if anything, the challenge has become more pronounced in the sense that the longer that this crisis goes on, the more difficult it is, the more fatigue that sets in amongst host communities, amongst host governments, and yet it is essential, I would argue, both for host communities and refugees to maximize their welfare. So what does that look like? How do we get to that? There's been experiments with compacts, refugee compacts. So the Jordan Compact is perhaps the most well-known in the region, which essentially acknowledges and says, Jordan, by hosting all of these refugees, your government is providing an international public good. By hosting refugees and agreeing that there should be a space in Jordanian public schools for Syrian refugee children, and that temporary work visas will be issued. I think the number that was envisioned was, I think it's 200,000, and I believe they have not reached anywhere close to that. And in exchange for that, Jordan will then benefit by receiving grants and concessionary loans and favorable trade terms, et cetera. The reality is far from what was envisioned, but I would hold this out there as something to think about, as how to get to this desirable win-win situation. I think we have not completely plumbed the depths of what's out there, and I would urge the World Bank and others to continue to work hard and be creative on trying to find those types of solutions. Very quickly, I promise 3 quick bottom lines, and then I'll stop. Actually, I already did one. So one was the win-win, so that's good. So focus on that. Second bottom line is that much more work needs to be done to fill gaps in data, and I commend you for focusing on empirically based, data-driven work. But the fact is, there's a lot that we don't know. We're still trying to learn much more about what are the drivers for returns, both for refugees and IDPs. And I really think it's important to understand IDP populations as well, which is a very different set, perhaps, of factors. Secondly, as I noted, we don't know what happens once refugees decide to return. As was noted, UNHCR's responsibility stops at the border. And there's a lot of concern and many questions about what happens to people when they decide to go back. So when southern Syria reverted to the control of the Syrian government, and a large number or some number of refugees from Jordan opted to go back and retake or go back to their homes in southern Syria, what happened to them? And I think we don't know. And to my mind, this is a huge gap in knowledge that we need to understand better. And again, finally, just the fidelity and the granularity of data, the importance of the difference of locales and the understanding of hyperlocal dynamics. Last point, and I'll circle back to where I started, which is that the Syrian conflict is far from over, unfortunately. And I think it's really important to understand, for example, that 2018 marked the year of greatest internal displacement in Syria since the outbreak of the conflict. This is largely due to the liberation of ISIS-held land, but nonetheless, it's really important to underscore this is far from over. And in that vein, I think it's important to bear in mind that Idlib is there, and there's many concerns about the 3 million or so Syrian civilians in Idlib, many of them internally displaced, many of those multiple times, and a concern that a renewed offensive by the Syrian regime could well lead to massive displacement, again, on a scale that, quite frankly, we have yet to see in the now almost 8 years of this conflict. And finally, I think, in particular, I think we need to keep a particular eye on Lebanon. Lebanon does host the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. It bears an incredible burden in this way, but it also has led to enormously difficult circumstances for Syrian refugees. And my understanding is there is concern of potentially a new wave of refugees from Lebanon to Cyprus, that route might be one that becomes of increasing importance. And Europe may well find itself faced once again with a new wave of refugees and all that comes with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona, for a very rich response and some very compelling arguments. I want to give the audience as much time as possible to ask their questions, but before we do that, I want to give Harun and Saroj an opportunity, if they want to pick up on anything that Mona said, to reply, and then I'll get out of the way and we'll open it up to the audience. No? Okay. Okay, please. So we have people in the back, I hope, with microphones. Do we? We have people even in the front with microphones. So so let us, since you're already over there, this gentleman right here.
Hi. My name is Benjamin Weil. I'm the former international advisor to the Israeli Minister of Energy. I didn't get a chance, obviously, in the last half an hour to read the entire report, so I don't know if you touched the subject. But I was curious to know if there's any analysis of whether government or NGO programs that help refugees or the misplaced Syrians is effective in terms of the education or the other topics you touched while they are abroad, and if that helps with then bringing them back to their homeland after the threat is eliminated. Because I know that in international relations, there's a theory that says that all these organizations, in order to continue being relevant, they will try to not maintain the status quo, but they want to be as relevant as long as they can so that the institution continues to function. On the other hand,
question, please.
They have resources to help the refugees.
Take a few more questions.
So we can do that. Okay, back here.
Hi, my name is Ava Havas, and just to add to your point, I understand that you wanted to separate the economics from the political, but when you're talking about return, I don't quite get how you could do that. I mean, you subsume some of that under security, but how can you talk about whether people can return in any great numbers without taking account of the political situation.
Okay. And the gentleman behind.
Thank you. I'm a Syrian researcher, actually. I just done a book about the demographic engineering. I would like actually to thank you for the report, but despite all the numbers, actually, it's difficult to get anything useful because the comparison sometimes is not comparable to other countries, depends on the conflict, how it's end, and the political situation. And then also, I just would give one example with support of what Mona said. I'm from the town called Daraya, 300,000 before 2011, and now the population of the city is 0. What's returned actually, it's 137. 137. Registered at the UNHCR is just 6 people. And 31 of these, the 137 lost, mostly detained and disappeared. This is why exactly all these factors, if we did not put it into perspectives, we lost actually the idea. This is why actually I support what's the UNHCR statement. They said that Pinheiro principles, which 13 factors should be taken into consideration before any countries can recommend return of the refugees. That include, of course, housing, properties, and security, and all of that. This is why I don't see how the World Bank work with the UNHCR with the same time Pinheiro principles never been mentioned or even never been honored. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to take those 3 questions, relief organizations, the political versus the economic, and then the demographic impact? All right.
So, okay. A couple of things, first of all. If you see the report, it very clearly, the starting point in the report is the UNHCR's broad principles of return, including the Geneva Convention, but more importantly, the safe, voluntary, and dignified return, I think. So that's the starting point of the report. Second, the UNHCR's current assessment is that the conditions are not yet conducive for return, for those conditions, for those returns to take place. And we strictly abide by the UNHCR's position on this. This report by no means is trying to question the UNHCR's assessment. You also raise a very important question that, yes, this report is not about the political analysis of what are needed essentially for return to take place, because what we are bringing into the broader political discussion is the social and economic analysis of the displacement, particularly for the displaced Syrians. And that also it is looking at only the refugees. It is not addressing the question of the internally displaced, which remains an agenda for research for us to continue working on this. But what is important is that the Geneva process and everyone who is engaged in that process, including on the question of returns, the findings of the report and the analysis provides an important input into that. So clearly an economic analysis providing an input into the political process, but not looking into the politics of that itself, because then you'll be essentially not being able to do a good job in terms of understanding the economic analysis of it. That's what the report does. But this is an input into the process. We took this report to Geneva, and we had extensive discussions with everyone who is part of the political process, so that they have this information. And we'll continue to make that effort. And our assessment and the feedback is that people who are part of that process, they have found the analysis to be very useful in terms of the ongoing discussion on the topic. There's a broader question that, Mona, you raised about the win-win. And how the Jordan Compact, and within that the special economic zones, and how the international community came forward. We were in fact one of the institutions helping Jordan government with a program for results, what we call it, which essentially we provide concessional financing to the Jordanian government, depending on the number of work permits issued to the Syrians, and also, of course, creating more opportunity for the Jordanians themselves. And that program, in our view, has been largely very successful, to the extent now that as of this year, the whole requirement of the work permit has been waived. So if you have the residency to be in the country, and many of these people are there, they have the residency permit and they'll be able to work, they don't have to renew their work permits. Last year we reached close to 100,000 of work permits to be issued. 200,000 is a cumulative target, by the way. The idea was that by the end of the program we will reach 200,000. So it was never the idea to achieve it every year, we will do it. So they have been made very good progress, and I think we should be really very grateful to the Jordanian government and the people actually for being so generous to the Syrian refugees. But there is still the discussion happening on the win-win. And this report provides some strong evidence of what that win-win may look like. And clearly in our view, if you see this education, the basic education can be a very strong enabler of that win-win. And this goes back to not just the narrative on no one left behind. Are you really going to lose this generation of Syrians? One thing you have to do is to invest in their education inside Syria and also in Lebanon and Jordan for the refugee children. And this is clearly a win-win in that perspective. And there are many things that you can build on, but clearly this report and the analysis by many other organizations provide a lot of evidence of what the win-win might look like in these countries. I will let Harun respond to a few other questions.
Okay. Yeah, on the whether we measured, I think there was a question from there, whether we measured the program success in host countries. It wasn't within the scope of this report, so we didn't try to analyze whether the programs are working to increase, let's say, the education level or after what happens after return. So we don't get into that discussion here. On economics and political, Saroj answered. I can give a more kind of technical response. I mean, I think it's only economists who believe that there can be an economics without political science or political dimension of the problem. So whatever is economical, it's political. Whatever is political is economical. We are aware of this. But in this report, what we restricted ourselves to is the things that we can measure. If we cannot measure it, we don't talk about it. So in this case, we look at the data. If there is data that enables us to analyze it, for example, the security condition. I mean, is the conflict political? Of course it is political. We looked at the conflict statistics in Syria, and we based our security analysis based on whether there is active conflict or not, along with the survey responses, whether people feel safe or not. So if there's data, we used it. If there's no data, we didn't consider that. So that is, I guess, in support of what Saroj said about in support of the political process, this economic analysis provides. And maybe one addition is that our main objective was not to come up and give a recipe of here is how you fix this problem. So that's not the objective of this report. We don't believe that it could be done as part of this report. So to our Syrian colleague, I know obviously this is disappointing, but unfortunately this report aims to provide a framework, an analytical framework, within which we can talk about refugee issues without going through advocacy or without going through. It's just the facts and how we can put these facts together and think about these issues. Again, disappointing. If I was Syrian, I would be disappointed. I'm not Syrian. I'm still disappointed that we didn't do that. But that was the objective of this report. I think that was it, yeah.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. Please make them very brief. We'll take one from this side and one from this side. This gentleman in the gray suit, and then this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Timur Al-Adiri. I work with the Netherlands Embassy, and I want to thank the Middle East Institute and the World Bank for this very interesting event. I have a short technical question about the simulations you did on the policies for return. You looked at subsidies, and I was wondering if you also took into account the effect of the returning refugees using those subsidies to create livelihood within Syria, because obviously that might impact their welfare as well. So I was just wondering if you also factor that in.
Okay, thank you. And last question over here, please, very quick, so we can get an answer.
Hi, I'm Philippe Patala from the Tahrir Institute, and I was hoping that you could talk a bit about the Assad regime's relationship to returning Syrians, because depending on how you look at it, either they want Syrians to return to make it look like Syria is ready for investment and rebuilding, or they don't want Syrians to return so that they can continue with the demographic engineering that's been going on.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Maybe you want to take that one. Huh? Okay, please, go ahead.
On the simulations, yes, it's a complete model where we consider the economic outcomes as a result of return, which has the real economy sector. So the answer is yes, we consider that when we did our welfare calculations. The simulations themselves are not just like any other economic model. These are abstract models. It doesn't capture the complexity of the real life. And there's only one reason for that. One, data might be missing or the computation might be heavy. In our case, it was both. For example, if you wanted to change a number in the simulation and press enter, you would have to come back next day to see what the result is. It's a very computationally heavy calculation because there's a lot of things going on. That was one factor. I think the other one, Mona.
Mona, you want to take the last question?
Yeah, very quickly. Great question. I think your question underscores precisely the political underpinnings of these questions. My response would be, in terms of who's desirous of refugee returns, I think it's far more the Russians who are looking for some degree of international legitimacy, and they view refugee returns in that light. I don't believe the Syrian regime is interested in massive refugee returns, particularly since many of those refugees would have been opposed to the government. And I think anecdotally, we see evidence of questions and concerns about detentions, about a renewed mukhabarat state, about forced conscription, et cetera. All of those factors underscore the difficulties for those returning to regime-held area. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially Harun and Saroj for an excellent presentation, and Mona, thank you so much for coming and sharing your own thoughts and reactions to this report. There are still copies of the report, I think, outside. If you haven't picked up a copy, please do so. Otherwise, Saroj and Harun are going to have to carry them back to the World Bank. And thank you all for coming. Okay? Okay, thanks.